The city lights stretched endlessly, a glittering sea of gold and silver against the midnight sky. Manhattan was alive, pulsing with energy even in the late hours. But inside the top-floor penthouse of one of its most exclusive high-rises, silence reigned. Alexander Carter stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass of whiskey dangling loosely from his fingers, his gaze fixed on the skyline. At 36, he had it all, at least on the surface. He was the CEO of Carter Enterprises, a tech empire worth billions, and a man who had built his fortune with ruthless precision. His tailored suits, imported whiskey, and luxury cars were symbols of his success. But beneath the polished exterior was a man running from his own past. That past had a name, Evelyn Monroe. It had been nearly a year since he had last seen her, a year since their world had shattered. Evelyn had been the love of his life, or so he had thought. She was everything he wasn't, warm, kind, and unwaveringly loyal. She had believed in love, in commitment, in forever. And Alexander? He had believed in power, ambition, and pleasure. That was his first mistake. His second mistake was Natasha Caldwell. The affair had been a cliché, a rich, powerful man falling into the arms of a younger, seductive socialite. Natasha was stunning, with a model's body and a dangerous smile. She had been a temptation he hadn't resisted. One night turned into two. Then two became something more. Evelyn had found out in the worst possible way. A leaked photo, a scandalous headline, the public humiliation. She had walked out of his life that night, and Alexander had done nothing to stop her. At the time, he had convinced himself it was for the best. He wasn't the settling down type. He had convinced himself he was free. But freedom came at a cost. Now, a year later, Evelyn was back in town, and she wasn't alone. A meeting that would change everything. The restaurant was upscale, private, the kind of place where deals were signed over $1,000 bottles of wine. Alexander sat at his usual table, checking his watch, impatient. He hadn't expected Evelyn to agree to this meeting. When his assistant had informed him that she was back in New York, he hadn't wasted a second reaching out. He needed to see her. But why? To apologize? To make amends? To see if she still hated him? Maybe all of the above. And then she walked in. For a second, Alexander forgot to breathe. Evelyn had always been beautiful. But now she was radiant. Her long chestnut hair cascaded over her shoulders, her hazel eyes sharp and unreadable. She was dressed in a simple yet elegant black dress, her posture poised, confident. But it wasn't just her presence that caught him off guard. It was a small but undeniable swell of her stomach. She was pregnant, and Alexander had a sinking feeling. He knew exactly who the father was. His chest tightened, an unfamiliar sense of dread creeping up his spine. He had come here thinking he was in control, that this was his moment to rewrite the past. But one look at Evelyn's growing belly, and he realized he had already lost. Alexander Carter was a man used to control. He dictated deals in boardrooms, commanded respect in high society, and had built an empire that answered only to him. But sitting across from Evelyn Monroe in the candlelit restaurant, his grip on control slipped through his fingers like sand. She was pregnant, and if his instincts were right, the child was his. Evelyn slid into the chair opposite him with a quiet confidence that unsettled him. She met his gaze directly, not with the pain or anger he had expected, but with a calmness that felt even more punishing. It was as if she had already made peace with the wreckage he had left in her life. And somehow, that was worse than if she had stormed in, demanding retribution. "You're glowing," he said, his voice smooth, practiced, an automatic response he would give any beautiful woman in his presence. But Evelyn wasn't just any woman. She never had been. She didn't smile. Save the charm, Alexander. Let's not pretend this is anything other than what it is. His jaw tightened. He wasn't used to this, to being on the back foot. "You're pregnant," he said finally, cutting through the tension with blunt force. Evelyn folded her hands on the table, her fingers grazing the edge of the white tablecloth. "Yes." His pulse thundered in his ears. The confirmation should have brought relief. At least now he wasn't imagining things, but instead it felt like a hammer to his chest. "Is it?" He hesitated, suddenly unsure if he wanted to finish the question. "Yours?" She arched a brow, the challenge clear. Yes, Alexander, this is your child. The world around them faded. The soft murmur of conversations, the clinking of expensive silverware, the flickering candlelight, it all blurred into irrelevance. He had a child. A year ago, he had let Evelyn walk away, convinced that whatever they had wasn't worth salvaging, that he was doing them both a favor. He had thought he could move on, that she would too. But now she was carrying his child, and she hadn't told him until now. Why didn't you tell me sooner? His voice was lower now, rougher. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, as if considering whether she even owed him an answer. Finally, she sighed, because I didn't need to. His brows furrowed. Didn't need to? She exhaled, and for the first time, a flicker of vulnerability crossed her face. After what happened, after what you did, I didn't see the point in chasing you down. You made your choice, Alexander. You chose her. Her, Natasha Caldwell. The name slithered into his thoughts like poison. Evelyn had every right to hate him. He had betrayed her in the worst way. Their relationship had been steady, real. She had trusted him, and he had shattered that trust for a fleeting thrill with a woman who, in the end, had meant nothing to him. And now, staring at the consequences of his past, he felt something unfamiliar, regret. Not the shallow kind, the kind that was merely inconvenient. This was deeper, colder, something that clawed at his insides. You should have told me, he said, though the words fell hollow. I had a right to know. Evelyn's lips pressed together in a thin line. A right? Alexander, do you really think you earned that right? He stared at her, searching for any trace of warmth of the woman who had once looked at him like he was her entire world. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone stronger. Someone who had learned to survive without him. Have you been alone? He asked after a moment. A shadow crossed her expression, but it was gone in an instant. I've been fine. The evasiveness in her answer made something tighten in his chest. Fine, he repeated. That's it. What do you expect me to say, Alexander? She leaned forward slightly, her voice measured but firm. That I cried myself to sleep every night? That I wish you'd come back? That I begged the universe for an apology that never came? His throat bobbed, but she didn't give him a chance to respond. No. I picked myself up, I rebuilt my life, and I made peace with the fact that the man I loved, she paused, inhaling sharply, wasn't who I thought he was. The words landed like a punch. He had always believed that time would soften the damage, that maybe, just maybe, if they ever crossed paths again, she'd still see something worth saving in him. But she didn't, and maybe that was what he deserved. Evelyn sat back in her chair, smoothing a hand over the fabric of her dress, where the slight swell of her stomach was visible. I didn't come here to rehash the past, Alexander. I came here because I knew you'd find out eventually, and I wanted to be the one to tell you. His fingers curled around the base of his whiskey glass. So what now? She hesitated. That depends. On what? On whether you're here because you want to be a father, or because you just don't like losing. The question burned. He wanted to say it wasn't about winning or losing, that this was another business deal, another strategic move. But was that the truth? For the first time in his life, Alexander Carter didn't have the answer. Alexander Carter had spent his entire life making problems disappear. With enough power, influence, and money, he could control any situation, except this one. Sitting across from Evelyn, watching the woman he had once loved carry his child with an unwavering strength that didn't include him, he realized just how powerless he truly was. And he hated it. The waiter approached, setting down 2 plates of food neither of them touched. The scent of seared steak and truffle risotto filled the air, but all Alexander could focus on was the wall Evelyn had built between them. I want to be involved, he said finally, breaking the silence. Evelyn's lips parted slightly, as if she hadn't expected those words. Then, just as quickly, her expression hardened. Why? Because it's my child, Evelyn. Our child. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her water glass. You don't get to show up now and act like this is some revelation. You had your chance to be a part of my life, of our life, and you threw it away. A muscle ticked in his jaw. He had expected anger. He had expected resistance. But he hadn't expected the ice in her voice to cut so deep. "You're right," he admitted, surprising even himself. "I messed up. I won't defend what I did. But this isn't just about you and me anymore. It's about the baby." She exhaled, shaking her head. "It was always just me and the baby. Alexander, you weren't there when I found out. You weren't there for the doctor's appointments, for the panic, for the moments I thought I couldn't do this alone." The guilt came like a wrecking ball, slamming into him with the force of all the months he had spent believing he was free of his past. But Evelyn wasn't finished. "And now, suddenly, you care?" She let out a dry laugh, one devoid of humor. "You expect me to just believe that?" "I don't expect anything," he said carefully. "I just know I can't walk away from this." Evelyn studied him, her hazel eyes searching for something. Maybe sincerity, maybe weakness. He wasn't sure which one he had to offer. "Even if I let you be involved," she said slowly, "that doesn't mean I forgive you. I'm not asking for forgiveness." The words were true, even if a small part of him wished otherwise. She looked down at her untouched plate, pushing a piece of asparagus aside with her fork. "Then what exactly are you asking for?" Alexander hesitated. He had expected this conversation to be difficult, but he hadn't anticipated how much he would despise being on the outside. "I just want a chance," he said, "to be a father, to make things right." Evelyn sighed, rubbing her temple as if she were already exhausted by the idea. "This isn't something you can fix, Alexander. There's no undo button, no deal to negotiate. It's not a contract you can rewrite." He knew that, but knowing didn't make it any easier. Before he could respond, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Alexander?" His entire body tensed at the familiar sound. Natasha Caldwell. Alexander closed his eyes for a brief second before turning his head. And there she was, standing beside their table, draped in an emerald green dress that clung to her body in all the right places. Her blonde hair was swept to one side, her lips painted the deep red he remembered too well. Natasha had always known how to make an entrance. Evelyn, to her credit, didn't flinch. She didn't look surprised. She didn't even look angry. She simply reached for her water and took a slow sip, as if this entire moment wasn't another cruel twist in fate's game. Alexander, however, felt his stomach drop. "Natasha," he said, his tone cool, controlled. She smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of expression that came from someone who knew exactly what kind of chaos they were about to stir. "I thought that was you," she purred. Then her gaze flickered to Evelyn. And Evelyn, wow, it's been a while. Evelyn finally set her glass down and folded her hands in her lap. "It has." There was no warmth in her voice, no anger either, just attachment. And somehow, that was more lethal than anything she could have said. Natasha's eyes drifted downward, and for the first time, she noticed Evelyn's growing belly. A slow, knowing smirk stretched across her lips. "Oh," she said, tilting her head. "Now this is unexpected." Alexander clenched his fists under the table, his patience wearing thin. Natasha, not now. But she ignored him, her gaze fixed on Evelyn like a predator sizing up prey. "And here I thought you had moved on. Guess some things never change." Evelyn didn't blink. "Guess not." Natasha laughed, shaking her head. "Well, this is interesting. I always wondered what would happen if you two crossed paths again. Looks like the answer is messy." Alexander had had enough. "Natasha, walk away." She raised an eyebrow. "Or what?" Evelyn's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Or you'll just prove, again, that you were never more than a mistake." For the first time, Natasha's smirk faltered. It was subtle, barely there, but Alexander caught it. And then, just as quickly, she recovered. "Well, I'll leave you two lovebirds to it," she said, her tone laced with mock sweetness. "Best of luck. You're going to need it." With that, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Alexander exhaled slowly, turning back to Evelyn, but her expression was unreadable. "Are you okay?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment, then placed her napkin on the table. "I think we're done here." He felt a sharp pang of frustration. Evelyn. But she was already pushing back her chair. Whatever you're looking for, Alexander, you won't find it in me. With that, she stood and walked away, leaving him sitting there, the weight of his mistakes crushing down on him. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Carter didn't know how to fix what he had broken. Alexander Carter had always believed that money and power could solve any problem. But as he watched Evelyn walk out of the restaurant, he realized he was facing a battle neither wealth nor influence could fix. His child, his ex, the life he had thrown away. And now, Natasha Caldwell, his biggest mistake, had reappeared just to remind him of everything he had lost. Alexander ran a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. He needed to think, to regain control. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the baby, his baby. He couldn't let Evelyn shut him out, no matter how much she despised him. The problem was, he wasn't sure he deserved to be let in. A visit from the past the next morning. Alexander sat in his corner office on the top floor of Carter Enterprises, staring blankly at the city skyline. Normally, the sight of Manhattan stretching beneath him gave him a sense of power, of invincibility. Not today. Today, all he could see was Evelyn's face. The cold finality in her eyes when she told him he wouldn't find what he was looking for in her. His phone buzzed. He expected it to be his assistant or one of his business partners. But when he glanced at the screen, his stomach dropped. Evelyn. For a brief second, hope sparked in his chest. Maybe she had reconsidered. Maybe she was willing to talk. But the message shattered that illusion. We need to set some boundaries. Let's talk. Meet me at Cafe Verona at 2 p.m. Alexander leaned back in his chair, gripping his phone tightly. Boundaries. The word alone made his jaw clench. He wasn't sure he could handle hearing her say she didn't need him again. But he would go. He had no choice. A conversation with consequences Cafe Verona was small, intimate, the kind of place that felt far removed from the chaos of the city. Evelyn sat near the window, stirring a cup of tea, her posture composed but guarded. Alexander slid into the seat across from her, studying her carefully. Even now, with everything between them fractured, he couldn't deny how effortlessly stunning she was. She didn't waste time. I've thought about it, and I want to be clear about what I expect from you. He folded his hands on the table. I'm listening. She took a deep breath. I don't want chaos in my life, Alexander. I don't want mind games or power struggles. If you truly want to be involved, it has to be on my terms. His jaw tightened. And those terms are? She met his gaze without hesitation. We co-parent. Nothing more. No late-night apologies. No attempts to fix what can't be fixed. And definitely no interference in my personal life. Something sharp twisted in his chest. Personal life? Evelyn's fingers tense around her cup. I have a life outside of this, Alexander, and I won't let you dictate it. There it was, the unspoken truth. She wasn't just moving on from him. She already had. He forced himself to remain calm. I just want what's best for our child. Then respect my boundaries. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He wanted to argue, to demand more, but he knew pushing her right now would only make things worse. Fine, he said finally, but I need something in return. She arched a brow. Excuse me? I need time, he said. Real time, doctor's appointments. Preparing for the baby. I won't be some absent father who gets updates through text messages. She hesitated, as if weighing the risk of letting him in. Finally, she nodded. Okay, but if you cross any lines, Alexander, I will shut you out. For good. He nodded. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. The threat that lurks as Alexander left the cafe. His phone buzzed again. This time, the name flashing across the screen made his stomach turn. Natasha Caldwell. He debated ignoring it, but he knew Natasha well enough to understand that she didn't just disappear when she wanted something. With a frustrated sigh, he answered, What do you want, Natasha? Her laughter was soft, almost playful. Is that any way to greet an old friend? We were never friends. She clicked her tongue. Harsh, but fair. Alexander exhaled, glancing at his watch. I don't have time for this. Oh, but I think you want to hear what I have to say. He closed his eyes briefly, already regretting picking up the call. Get to the point. There was a pause. Then her voice dropped into something more serious. You know, Alexander, I really thought you were smarter than this. But getting involved with Evelyn again? Risky move. His grip on the phone tightened. Stay out of this, Natasha. Can't do that, she said smoothly. Because you see, there are things Evelyn doesn't know. Things about you. And if she finds out, well, let's just say your little attempt at redemption will be dead before it starts. A chill ran down his spine. Are you threatening me? He asked, his voice low. Natasha sighed dramatically. Not at all. Just reminding you that actions have consequences. Before he could respond, she hung up. Alexander stood frozen on the sidewalk, his mind racing. Natasha was dangerous, not because she had power, but because she knew things he had worked hard to bury. And if she was hinting at what he thought she was, then everything was about to get a whole lot worse. Alexander Carter prided himself on his ability to remain composed under pressure. He had built an empire by making ruthless decisions, cutting ties when necessary, and ensuring his past never caught up with him. But Natasha Caldwell was a loose thread he had failed to cut, and now she was threatening to unravel everything. The warning later that evening, Alexander sat in his penthouse, staring out at the New York skyline, his mind replaying Natasha's words over and over. There are things Evelyn doesn't know, things about you, and if she finds out... He clenched his fists. There was only one thing Natasha could be referring to, the deal with Morgan Steele. It had been years ago, back when Alexander had been hungry for expansion. Steel Industries was on the brink of collapse, drowning in debt. Alexander had seen an opportunity and seized it. He had played dirty, orchestrating a series of aggressive takeovers and buying out Steele's shareholders until Morgan Steele had no choice but surrender. Morgan hadn't just lost his company. He had lost everything. His reputation was ruined, his assets stripped away, and soon after, rumors spread that he had taken his own life. Alexander had never confirmed those rumors. He had told himself it was just business, nothing personal. But now, if Natasha had proof, emails, financial records, anything that painted him as a villain, Evelyn would see him for exactly what he was. And she would never let him near their child. A shocking revelation determined to get ahead of Natasha's scheme. Alexander drove to Evelyn's apartment the next morning. He wasn't going to let Natasha control the narrative. He needed to tell Evelyn the truth before she heard it from someone else. When he arrived, he found her sitting in the small courtyard outside, a book resting on her lap. She looked up, surprised. Alexander? We need to talk, he said. Evelyn frowned but set her book aside. Is something wrong? He hesitated. There was no easy way to say this. It's about something from my past. Something Natasha might try to use against me. Evelyn's expression hardened at the mention of Natasha. Go on. He took a breath. Years ago, I orchestrated a takeover of a company called Steel Industries. The owner, Morgan Steele, lost everything. There were rumors that he might have taken his own life because of it. Evelyn blinked, processing his words. And what exactly did you do? I was ruthless, Alexander admitted. I didn't care about the collateral damage. I cared about winning. And now, Natasha's threatening to use that against me, to make you believe I'm some kind of monster. Evelyn studied him for a long moment. Then, to his surprise, she let out a breath and said, I already knew about Steel Industries. His heart stopped. You what? She nodded. I did my research when we were together, Alexander. I knew the kind of businessman you were. And honestly, she shook her head. It's not what Natasha says that scares me. It's what you haven't said. His chest tightened. What do you mean? Evelyn exhaled. I know you're trying, but part of me still wonders. Are you doing this because you truly want to be a father? Or are you just afraid of losing again? Alexander opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come, because for the first time, he wasn't sure he knew the answer. The breaking point before Alexander could find the right words, Evelyn's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her expression darkening. It's Natasha, she muttered. Alexander's jaw clenched. What does she want? Evelyn turned the screen toward him. It was a message. You think Alexander is being honest with you? Think again. Meet me tonight. You deserve the truth. His pulse spiked. You can't meet her. Evelyn narrowed her eyes. Why not? What else is there, Alexander? He swallowed hard. Natasha doesn't care about the truth. She just wants to destroy me. Evelyn folded her arms. Then tell me, what exactly is she holding over you? Silence stretched between them. And then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, Evelyn asked, Is there more, Alexander? Something worse. His throat tightened. He wanted to say no. He wanted to assure her that there was nothing left for Natasha to use. But deep down, he knew Evelyn wouldn't believe him. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't believe himself either. Alexander Carter had never been afraid of confrontation. He had built his empire by facing challenges head-on, never hesitating to make the tough calls. But as he stood outside Evelyn's apartment, knowing she was inside debating whether to meet Natasha, a feeling he barely recognized crept over him. Fear. If Evelyn walked into whatever trap Natasha had set, she would see him through Natasha's lens, a cold, calculating man who destroyed lives without remorse. And maybe that's exactly what he was. A desperate plea. Alexander knocked, his patience too thin for subtlety. A few seconds later, Evelyn opened the door, her expression unreadable. You came back, she said. He exhaled sharply. Don't meet with her, Evelyn. Whatever she's feeding you, it's a lie. Evelyn leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. That's the thing, Alexander. I don't know if I can believe you anymore. His stomach tightened. Then let me prove it to you. She scoffed, shaking her head. And how exactly do you plan to do that? Let me explain everything. The whole truth. No more half-truths, no more dodging. Just you and me. Evelyn studied him, searching for something in his face. Then she stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. Fine, she said. Start talking. The truth unveiled. Alexander sat on the couch, rubbing his hands together before looking up at her. What I did to Morgan Steele, it wasn't just business. I didn't just destroy his company. I ruined his life. Evelyn stiffened but didn't interrupt. I manipulated the market against him, got to his board members, turned his closest allies into enemies. I made sure that when he lost, there was nothing left for him to rebuild. His voice was tight, filled with something he rarely allowed himself to feel, regret. Evelyn's expression was unreadable. And what happened to him? Alexander hesitated, his fingers tightening into fists. He disappeared. No one knows if he's alive or dead. Evelyn inhaled sharply. And Natasha? What's her connection? He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Natasha was involved with Morgan back then. She blamed me for what happened to him. And maybe she's right too. Evelyn stood there for a long moment, silent. Finally, she spoke. So what now? She wants revenge. That's what I'm trying to figure out, he admitted. But Evelyn, if you meet with her, she'll spin this into something worse than it already is. She'll use whatever she can to turn you against me. Evelyn shook her head. She doesn't have to. You did that all on your own. The words cut deep, but before Alexander could respond, Evelyn winced, clutching her stomach. An unforgiving twist. Alexander's heart pounded. Evelyn. She took a shaky breath. It's nothing, just a sharp pain. But he wasn't convinced. We're going to the hospital. Evelyn tried to protest, but another wave of discomfort made her grip the back of the couch for support. That was all the confirmation Alexander needed. He grabbed his phone, already dialing for a car. We're leaving. Now. Evelyn didn't argue this time. As they made their way out, Alexander's mind raced. The past didn't matter right now. Only Evelyn and the baby did. And if anything happened to them, he would never forgive himself. The car ride to the hospital was silent, except for Evelyn's controlled breathing and Alexander's rapid typing as he messaged his private physician. Every second felt like a lifetime. Evelyn clutched her belly, her face pale but determined. I don't want you to panic, she murmured. Alexander shot her a sharp look. Too late for that. She exhaled slowly, as if trying to calm herself as much as him. It's not labor. It's just pain. But that didn't reassure him. He had no experience with this. No way of knowing what was normal and what wasn't. And for the first time in years, he felt completely powerless. When they reached the hospital, Alexander was out of the car before the driver even fully stopped, rushing to help Evelyn. A nurse quickly ushered her into a wheelchair and wheeled her inside while Alexander followed, barely holding himself together. As they disappeared behind the examination room doors, a hand clapped down on his shoulder. Well, didn't think I'd see you here, Carter." Alexander turned sharply, his patience wearing thin. And there she was, Natasha Caldwell. An unwanted encounter. She leaned against the wall, arms crossed, her red lips curled into a smirk. "What are the odds? You, standing outside a hospital room, looking genuinely worried. Almost makes you seem human." "Not now, Natasha," Alexander growled. She clicked her tongue. "Oh, but I think now is the perfect time. Evelyn's in there, vulnerable, scared. And you? You're pacing outside like a man who finally realizes he can't control everything." His fists clenched, but Natasha simply pulled out her phone. "I was going to let Evelyn discover the truth over dinner, but maybe she won't be in the mood for a date after this. So, why don't I just give you a little preview?" She pressed play on a voicemail. "Alexander Carter will pay for what he did. I swear it." The voice was low, broken, but unmistakable. Morgan Steele. Alexander's blood ran cold. "You're lying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Natasha's smirk widened. "Morgan's alive, and he's coming back for everything you took from him." A moment of truth before Alexander could react. A nurse stepped out. "Mr. Carter?" He turned immediately. "How is she? The baby?" The nurse offered a reassuring smile. "She's stable. The pain was caused by stress and overexertion, but both mother and baby are okay." The relief that flooded him was so intense that his knees nearly buckled. "Can I see her?" he asked. The nurse nodded, and without sparing Natasha another glance, Alexander stepped inside the room. Evelyn lay in bed, her face tired but relieved. When she saw him, she gave him a small, weak smile. "I told you not to panic." He walked over and sat beside her, exhaling a long breath. Easier said than done. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, Evelyn reached for his hand. "I heard your voice outside." "Who was that?" He hesitated, but there was no more room for lies. "It was Natasha," he admitted. "She told me something that changes everything." Evelyn's eyes searched his. "What is it?" He took a deep breath, gripping her hand tighter. "Morgan Steele is alive." Evelyn's fingers stiffened in Alexander's grasp. She stared at him, her breathing steady but her eyes filled with unspoken questions. "Morgan is alive?" she whispered, almost as if saying it out loud would make it less real. Alexander nodded, his jaw tight. "Natasha played me a voicemail. It was him. There's no mistaking it." For a long moment, Evelyn didn't say anything. Then she let out a slow breath, shaking her head. "All this time, you thought you had destroyed him." Alexander looked away. "I thought he was gone. And maybe that was easier to believe than facing the truth, that he's been out there, waiting for the right moment." Evelyn studied him carefully. "And now he's back." Alexander swallowed hard. "And he wants revenge." The burden of the past, the weight of it all pressed down on him. But something was different. For the first time, he wasn't facing this alone. Evelyn wasn't turning away. She wasn't looking at him with disgust or fear. Instead, she squeezed his hand and said, "Then we deal with it." A lump formed in his throat. "You're not afraid?" "I'm terrified," she admitted. "But I'm also tired of running from the truth." He exhaled, nodding. "Me too." There was no undoing the past, no rewriting the choices he had made. But maybe, just maybe, he could start making the right ones now. A dangerous meeting the next evening. Alexander arranged a private meeting with Natasha. It wasn't difficult. She had been waiting for this moment, confident that she had backed him into a corner. When he arrived at the dimly lit lounge, she was already there, a glass of wine in her hand. Her red lips curved into a knowing smirk. "Didn't think you'd actually show," she mused. "But then again, you never could resist a power play." Alexander sat across from her, his expression unreadable. "Where is he?" Natasha arched a brow. "Morgan." She swirled her wine. "He's closer than you think." "Enough games, Natasha," Alexander said coolly. "What does he want?" She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He doesn't just want to ruin you, Alexander. He wants you to suffer." Alexander tensed. "And you're helping him?" She laughed softly. "You assume I have a choice?" She tilted her head. "Morgan lost everything because of you, and now he's built something new. He doesn't need money or power. He has influence, connections, people who hate you just as much as he does." Alexander clenched his fists under the table. "Then why hasn't he come for me himself?" Natasha's smirk faded. "Because he's waiting for the perfect moment. And believe me, Alexander, he will break you." A man in the shadows, the meeting left Alexander restless. He knew Natasha was playing her own game, but one thing was clear. Morgan Steele wasn't a ghost anymore. He was real, and he was coming. That night, as he sat in his penthouse, staring at the city below, his mind raced. For years, he had been the one pulling the strings, the one dictating the outcomes. But now, for the first time, he was a target. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. When he opened it, he found Evelyn standing there, her expression unreadable. "I thought you'd still be at the hospital," he said. "I was discharged this afternoon," she said, "but I didn't want to go home yet." He stepped aside, letting her in. "You should be resting." Evelyn turned to face him. "So should you." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't think I can." She hesitated, then walked closer. "Alexander, listen to me. You are not the same man you were back then. You have a chance to do something different this time, to face the consequences instead of running from them." His gaze met hers, and for the first time, he allowed himself to believe it. "I don't know if I deserve that chance," he admitted. Evelyn reached for his hand, squeezing gently. "Maybe not, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't take it." The first step Alexander had spent his entire life avoiding the wreckage he left behind. But now, he had something to fight for, someone to fight for. And if Morgan Steele was coming for him, he wouldn't run. The next morning, Alexander Carter made a decision, one he never thought he would make. He wasn't going to wait for Morgan Steele to make the first move. He was going to find him. For years, he had dictated the terms of every battle, control the outcome before the fight even began. But this was different. This time, he had something to lose. Evelyn, their child. He couldn't afford to let his past take them away from him. A reckoning with the past through his network. It didn't take long to locate Morgan. He had resurfaced in New York under a different name, quietly rebuilding himself in the shadows. But he wasn't hiding. He was waiting. So, Alexander walked straight into the Lion's Den. A private bar, dim lighting, a corner booth occupied by a man who looked both familiar and changed, Morgan Steele. His once polished demeanor had been replaced by something harder, colder. His piercing gaze met Alexander's, and a slow smirk spread across his face. "Well," Morgan mused, swirling his drink, "if it isn't the king himself. I was wondering when you finally stop hiding." Alexander sat down across from him, keeping his expression unreadable. "I came to talk." Morgan raised a brow. "Talk? You think after everything, we're just going to talk?" "I don't expect forgiveness," Alexander said. "I don't even expect understanding. But I won't let you use Evelyn and my child as weapons in a war that should have ended years ago." Morgan's jaw tightened. "You destroyed my life, Carter." "I know," Alexander admitted. "And I don't expect you to believe this, but I regret it." Morgan scoffed. "Regret won't bring back what I lost." Alexander met his gaze. "No, it won't. But revenge won't give you back what you lost either." For the first time, something flickered in Morgan's eyes, a shadow of hesitation. Alexander leaned forward. "If you come for me, I won't run. I won't fight. But I won't let you destroy the people I love." So, tell me, what will actually satisfy you? Ruining me? Or proving you don't need to? Morgan studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, he let out a slow breath. You really have changed, haven't you? Alexander didn't answer. He didn't need to. Morgan finished his drink, then stood up. I don't forgive you, Carter, but I'm done chasing ghosts. And just like that, he walked away. No war, no bloodshed, just an ending, a new beginning later that evening. Alexander returned to Evelyn's apartment. She opened the door, searching his face for answers. Did you find him? He nodded. It's over. Evelyn studied him carefully. And you're okay? He let out a breath he didn't know he had been holding. For the first time in a long time, yeah, I think I am. She stepped closer, resting a hand on his chest. So what now? Alexander looked down at her, at the woman who had challenged him, broken him, and somehow still believed in him. Now, he said, voice steady, I start being the man you and our child deserve. And as he pulled her into his arms, he knew this was the only victory that had ever truly mattered.